Hello, this lecture is the fourth of 5 lectures that focus on early Korean exhibition culture and collecting practices. Today's lecture examines the acquisition of Korean artifacts in America, where many collections of Korean art were formed in the early 20th century by private individuals and museum institutions. At a time when relatively little was known about Korea and travel to the peninsula was difficult, the art collections presented important insights into the arts and cultural traditions of Korea. Already from the 1890s, displays of Korean objects in public institutions in America, such as the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston and the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C., offered American people a unique opportunity to see artifacts from the Korean peninsula. In my first lecture on this course, I spoke about the establishment of trade and diplomatic relations between Chosun, Korea and Japan in 1876 with the signing of the Ganghwa Treaty. The treaty is important as it marks the first of several such so-called unequal treaties which Chosun signed with foreign powers. In 1882, the United States became the first nation outside East Asia to establish a treaty of amity and commerce with the Chosun Kingdom. Titled the Shufelt Treaty, it takes its name after Commodore Robert W. Shufelt of the United States Navy, who played a crucial role in negotiating the agreement. The following year, Lucius H. Foote was appointed as the first U.S. resident minister and consul general to Korea. Diplomatic relations between Chosun and the United States persisted until 1905, when Korea became a Japanese protectorate and lost its sovereignty. The American presence in Korea was considerable. The Americans were instrumental in building Korea's first steam railway, and they were involved in constructing a waterworks and an electric plant. Additionally, several Americans served as close advisors to King Kojong. American Protestant missionaries who arrived in the 1880s, such as Horace Underwood and Homer Hulbert, significantly influenced the peninsula through their educational and medical efforts. In the 19th century, World's Fairs and international expositions were gigantic spectacles that celebrated progress and advancement of civilized nations, juxtaposed with displays of exotica from regions outside Europe and America. Their establishment coincided with the birth of ethnographic collections that similarly aimed to document and display tangible records of so-called primitive cultures. Huge numbers of objects were collected, classified, and catalogued using methods developed from the new academic disciplines of ethnography, anthropology, and archaeology. To this end, in the 1880s, several museums in America and Europe tasked individuals in Korea with collecting objects that in type and medium were deemed representative of Korean life and culture. The U.S. National Museum, now the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C., quickly seized the opportunity to acquire Korean artifacts in the peninsula once access became possible. The Smithsonian Institution now prides itself as being the world's largest museum, education, and research complex. The institution was founded in 1846 with funds from the Englishman James Smithson, according to his wishes, under the name of the Smithsonian Institution, an establishment for the increase and diffusion of knowledge. Within this aim was the keenness to display artifacts from different cultures and nations, including so-called newly discovered territories such as East Asia. Around 6 months after the establishment of the Shufelt Treaty, the museum appointed the U.S. Navy officer John Baptist Bernadotte to the position of Smithsonian attaché and trained him in methods of collecting museum specimens in preparation for duty in Korea. Bernadotte was born in Philadelphia in 1858. He served as an officer in the United States Navy during the Spanish-American War in 1898. He was one of 18 naval officers who were appointed by the Smithsonian Institution. He arrived on the peninsula in early 1883 and immediately began his task of acquiring items of ethnological interest for the museum. Over the following 2 years, he acquired 156 items, ranging from ceramics to paintings, furniture, books, and maps, among other types of artifacts. The collection offers important insights into which types of artifacts were made in Korea during Bernadoe's time, and which he found noteworthy enough to collect for the museum. Most of the objects Bernadoe acquired for the museum were of contemporary manufacture. In his letters to the director of the Smithsonian Institution, he singled out wood carving, brasswork, and furniture as good, but was less positive about paintings, stating that there appears to be no living artist of note in Korea. The artifacts that Bernadoe acquired in Korea were included in a catalogue of the Korean collection in the U.S. National Museum, authored by Walter Hugh and published in 1893. The catalogue is available online, and I recommend that you take a look, especially if you're interested in this period, as the illustrations of the objects and the explanations of them provide interesting insight into early American understandings of the Korean peninsula. Walter Hugh was an American ethnologist who worked at the Smithsonian Institution for more than 30 years. But the Smithsonian Institution was not the only museum in America which was eager to expand their collections with artifacts acquired in Korea. In the 1880s, the director of the Peabody Academy of Sciences, now known as the Peabody Essex Museum in Salem, Massachusetts, was equally keen to acquire Korean artifacts for the museum's collection. He was called Edward Sylvester Morse, and he was an influential expert of Japanese art and history. Originally, he was a scholar of brachiopods, which is a type of shell. It was his studies of coastal brachiopods that made him visit Japan in 1877. His trip turned into a 3-year-long stay, as he was offered a post as professor of zoology at Tokyo Imperial University. It was during this time that he became interested in archaeology and Japanese ceramics, leading to him amassing a huge collection of more than 5,000 Japanese ceramics, most of them from the pre-modern period. His keenness to learn about the origins of Japanese ceramic manufacture made him acquire several Korean vessels too, and for this reason Morse is well known also to scholars of Korean art. Morse's aims to expand the museum's collection of Korean artifacts led him to contact somebody called Paul George von Müllendorf, whom he met while traveling in China in the early 1880s. Müllendorf is an extremely interesting character, as he was not only the first, but also the highest-ranking Westerner to be employed by the Joseon court. Originally from Zedenick in Germany, between 1874 and 1882, he served as interpreter and consul at the German consulate in Tianjin and Shanghai. In December 1882, Müllendorf arrived in Korea to take up the post of First Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs. He remained in Korea until December 1885, when he returned to Tianjin, having fallen out of favor with Gojong and stripped of his position. Morse asked Müllendorf to acquire Korean objects for the museum for the sum of $150 and gave him a brief list of desirable objects. In January 1884, 4 crates arrived in Salem, filled with more than 200 objects of various kinds, ranging from items of clothing to eating utensils and ceramics. In March 1884, the Peabody Academy of Sciences opened a display of the Korean artifacts, and a visitor's guide to Salem, published in the 1890s, proudly noted that the collection was the largest from Korea in any museum in America. In the late 19th century, several Americans who lived in Korea also acquired Korean artifacts. One of the most active in this regard was the American missionary, physician, and later diplomat Horace Newton Allen. Allen began working in the U.S. legation in 1889, rising to the rank of United States Minister Plenipotentiary to the Korean Empire in 1897, a post he held until 1905, when the treaty between the U.S. and Joseon was abrogated. In contrast to Morse, Horace Allen was not a ceramic scholar, but he was an avid collector who amassed a range of Korean artifacts while he served in Korea. He played a leading role in introducing them to America through his involvement in the Korean displays at the Columbian Exposition in Chicago, which I discussed in an earlier session. In the early 1890s, he lent and later donated a collection of contemporary everyday Korean artifacts to the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C., which were included in the catalogue authored by Hugh that I mentioned earlier. He also succeeded in building a collection of close to 80 pieces of high-quality ceramics from the Goryeo dynasty while living in Korea. In 1907, Allen sold his ceramic collection to the American industrialist Charles Lang Freer. Freer was one of the most well-known collectors of Asian art of his time, with an outstanding collection of Buddhist and secular works of art from China, Korea, and Japan. Prior to his death in 1919, he donated his collection to the American nation, and his Korean artifacts can now be found on display inside the Freer Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. This session has introduced the ways in which early American interest in Korea led to the collecting of Korean artifacts by American museums and private individuals. We focused on the collecting activities of the Smithsonian Institution and the Peabody Essex Museum. In the next and final session of this lecture on the collecting and exhibition of Korean artifacts, we will turn to how public displays of Korean art in Korea changed the cultural landscape.